We're continuing in our study in the books of Samuel. We are currently now in the early monarchy period. 2 weeks ago, we covered Samuel's farewell address in chapter 12, and it worked out pretty well because I didn't want to cover all of chapter 13 last time. I mainly wanted to talk about Saul offering the sacrifice and then having the covenant revoked by Samuel, whatever that means. And since we had the business meeting, we were able to only cover about half of chapter 13. So we are currently now in the saga of Saul that will carry on through the rest of 1 Samuel. And last time we covered the first half of 13, which is mainly him offering the sacrifice, having the covenant taken away from him. And this week, we will cover the rest of chapter 13 as well as most of chapter 14. This is a section that I don't know if the entire section you're familiar with, but there is a story within the section I know you're familiar with because I've heard it taught here since I've been a member. The commentaries are confusing to me because the commentaries either want to focus on the failure of Saul or on the heroism of Jonathan. And that's typically how this section is taught. It usually focuses on one or the other. And I've come to the conclusion that I had a sort of apostrophe moment this morning, the word epiphany, that to focus on one or the other is really missing the point, that there's a reason why these two stories are kind of going on at the same time. So we're seeing both the decline of Saul and the possible rise of Jonathan as a hero. So, and again, I think it's important that we see the two paralleled and in contrast. So, beginning in verse 16, Saul, his son Jonathan, and the troops who were with them were staying in Geba of Benjamin, and the Philistines were camped at Michmash. Now, right off the bat, there's a couple of questions that we may want to ask. We probably should ask as we're kind of thrown into this, because this is coming right on the heels of verse 15, which is, the failure of Saul, the covenant's been revoked, and so on. And so now we're just immediately thrown into this whole new episode. And so the questions we might ask is, first of all, where is Geba and why do we care? Second, and perhaps most importantly, how much time has passed since verse 15? Because since it's just one verse within a chapter, we may assume it's coming right after, but it seems like a certain amount of time has to have passed between the two events. It's just, we have no idea. It could be days, could be months, could be years. We just have no idea. But it seems as though a fair amount of time has passed, possibly years, between verse 15 and verse 16. The next question that's just kind of fun to ask is, how old is Jonathan? Because Scripture really gives us no indication of how old. The sort of scholarly consensus is that he's about 10 years older than David, so they are not the same age. And he dies around age, I want to say 35. So we can kind of work our way backwards from there. But the short answer is, to these three questions, we just don't know. We have no idea where Geba is. We have no idea how much time has passed, and we have no idea how old Jonathan is. The presiding assumption here, I was looking to see what the Jewish tradition is, but I could not find it. And the commentaries tend to avoid this question. It seems like the presumption a lot of people make is he has to be around age 20, because over and over again, particularly in Numbers, we see the magic number of 20 appear. So in Numbers 145, so all the Israelites 20 years old or more, everyone who could serve in Saul and Israel's army were registered by their ancestral houses. It seems like you have to be 20 to serve in the military. So if Jonathan is now a soldier, the assumption is he needs to be around 20. Although some commentaries accept that he might be a little younger than that, considering he's the prince and he's Saul's son and whatnot. But still, the idea that he's much younger than that seems hard to accept. So then the question is, earlier in chapter 13, we get the traditional age of Saul is 30. So if Jonathan is 20 right now and Saul's 30, that's hard to add up, which means Saul probably has to be older than 30 by this point, which means that there needs to be some sort of chronological break between the first half of chapter 13 and the second half of chapter 13 to account for the leap in Jonathan's age, which makes sense. It's just that there's nothing within the chapter to tell us that there's been this break. The next issue is, where is Geba? So in terms of significance, we don't really know what the significance of Geba is. What everyone seems to agree on, even though we've never found it, we don't know for sure, is that Geba, so here's the map. Jerusalem is the gold blob, Gibeah, or thereabouts, is the blue blob, and Michmash, which is kind of the center of this whole episode, is the red up above. Bethel's to the northwest, Gilgal's to the east. That little red dot, which is east of Ramah, that's where Samuel lives, and just south of Michmash, that seems to be where people assume Geba is. But again, we don't know for sure, but it seems to be somewhere between Michmash and Jerusalem, east of Ramah. I know you were all just on pins and needles about where on earth Geba was. So beginning then in verse 17, raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 divisions. One division headed toward the Ophrah road leading to the land of Shual. The next division headed to Beth Horon road, and the last division headed toward the border road that looks out over the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. So I've kind of expanded the map a little bit. It's a little blurry, but hopefully you'll be able to at least see a little better. So we've taken that section, we've blown up where all those blobs are. So we have Jerusalem, Gibeah, and Michmash. The Ophrath is north of Rimmon, so north of Michmash. So the first group is heading north, simple enough. The second group is heading northwest to the green blob. And then the final group is heading to the valley of Zeboim. And the valley of Zeboim is the river valley north of Gilgal on the west bank of the Jordan. So one group's heading north, one group's heading northwest, and one group's heading northeast. That's easy enough to keep track of. Then in verse 19, we have no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. Now, we don't know what happened to the blacksmiths. Were they killed? Were they kidnapped? Who knows? We are currently around the 11th century BC, so sometime between 1100 and 1000. David becomes king around 1000. That's easy enough to remember. We are still in the early Iron Age, iron being widely used as early as 1200, maybe even before then. Iron was used by the Hittites and eventually by the Egyptians. One of the interesting things that I learned in reading about and teaching the history of the ancient world is, why did the ancient civilizations start to switch over to iron? Any guesses? Okay, so the answer is, it is stronger. That is incorrect. So but he gave me the answer I wanted. I wanted the wrong answer. I could say he's wrong. So by the end of the Bronze Age, they've gotten very good at using bronze. And bronze, of course, is a combination of copper and tin, and you need those exact ingredients. Both are rare metals, and you have to blend them very precisely to make high-quality bronze. And then you have to have very skilled laborers to work the bronze. But you get the right, if you get high-quality bronze and you get a very good smith to work the bronze, you can make very good implements out of bronze. The reason why everyone started switching over to iron is because iron is very common, very plentiful, especially around the Mediterranean. But the thing is, unless you know how to smelt it correctly, iron's actually really brittle. So the initial transition was because of how common it was, not because it was stronger. It won't be until much later in the Iron Age when they realize that iron, if forged correctly, is much stronger than bronze. So eventually they'll get there, but that's not why they've transitioned at this point. We're still in the early Iron Age. But the Philistines, we know, were early users of iron. They were on the coast. They had relations to other seafaring groups, and so they already use iron. They know how significant it is. They know how powerful it is. They know how important it is. So the idea that they would want to keep the Israelites from using iron certainly makes sense. And they certainly don't want them using iron because iron's easier to acquire than bronze. And it's also, you can use it to make weapons, obviously. So then the next two verses, the Israelites went out to the Philistines to sharpen their plows, mattocks, axes, and sickles. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for plows and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for pitchforks and axes, and for putting a point on an ox goad. I have no idea what the running cost was for getting your implements sharpened, but obviously the Philistines want a monopoly on smithing. They want to know what the Israelites have. They want to be able to control what tools they have, what implements they have, and also to make sure the Israelites aren't using their resources to make weapons. And then they're charging a premium to get what utensils they have maintained, sharpened, and so on. So they're putting a pretty hefty economic toll on Israel, while keeping a stranglehold on what they can use. So then in verse 22, so on the day of the battle, not a sword or spear could be found in the hand of any of the troops who were with Saul and Jonathan. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had weapons. So on the left, you have weapons that have been attributed to Philistines. I don't know for sure. On the right, you have a couple of early Iron Age swords. The one on the left, so the right picture, but the left one, is a Hittite sword. So Hittites are the nation to the north of Israel. So it's probably not too dissimilar to the kinds of weapons that they might be using. This is early Iron Age. But the idea that not everyone's going to have a sword is probably not all that uncommon, because swords, for the most part, are very impractical objects. Axes can be used to chop down trees, knives can be used to cut things and to skin animals or whatnot. A sword is very impractical. It's just a long piece of metal with two edges, right? The only reason why you'd have a sword is to kill somebody. And unless you're a soldier, you don't usually need a sword. Again, axe has all kinds of uses, a knife has uses, even a spear can be used for various things. But a sword is generally a weapon for war. So unless you are royalty or a professional soldier, you may not use a sword or need a sword. So the idea that swords are going to be common throughout Israel shouldn't be a surprise to us, not until they actually have a standing army when they need weapons for soldiers and whatnot. But Saul and Jonathan obviously are going to have swords because they're royalty and Saul's the king and all that. So then in verse 23, now a Philistine garrison took control of the pass at Michmash. Again, this is probably another hint that a fair amount of time has passed, because it wasn't that long ago, at least in terms of the text, that Saul was stationed at Michmash. So enough time has passed where they're all kind of playing a shell game, where they're all moving around each other. Saul has moved his forces for whatever reason. The Philistines have now moved into Michmash, and they're all just kind of dancing around each other. So then in chapter 14, the same day, Saul's son Jonathan said to the attendant who carried his weapons, "Come on, let's cross over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." However, he did not tell his father. Now this is, the first half of chapter 14 is a very famous story, but again, I think that it's told within the context of what's going on with Saul in the surrounding narrative. So in verse 2, Saul was staying under the pomegranate tree in Migron on the outskirts of Gibeah. The troops with him numbered about 600. We already know that Saul has been kind of bleeding troops because of the Philistine menace and all the pressures. And so his army is slowly dwindling down. That Saul is just hanging out under a tree is interesting, because he doesn't really have a formal base of operations. There is no palace. There is no fortress for him to call his own. This actually harkens back more to the time of the Judges, where he's presiding under a tree, hearing cases under a tree, almost like Deborah, what she was doing. So it may be intentional by Samuel, whoever's writing, that it's trying or going out of its way to depict Saul as more of a judge-like figure than the king that he should be. So then in verse 3, Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, or the ephod, was also there. He was the son of Ahitub, the brother of Ichabod, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh, but the troops did not know that Jonathan had left. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. We have not heard about Ahijah or Ahitub in the narrative at this point. However, we should know who Ichabod is. So if we go, remember, all the way back to chapter 4, 19 to 21, the house of Eli has been judged. And Phinehas and Hophni go and take the ark to go fight the Philistines. The army is defeated. The two sons of Eli are killed. And Phinehas' wife dies in childbirth. So Eli, Phinehas, Hophni, and Ichabod's mother all die at the same time as part of the judgment on Eli. What we are not told is that Phinehas apparently had an older son. It has to be an older son because Phinehas dies that day, so it's hard for him to have another son after Ichabod since he's already dead. So presumably this has to be this Ahitub is the older son, which would also explain why his son is now the priest as opposed to Ichabod. So we're even told here the brother of Ichabod, because within the narrative, right, we know who Ichabod is. We just don't know who the other two are. So Ahijah was wearing an ephod, and this is ominous for a couple of reasons. This is ominous because we already know that the house of Eli has been judged. We know that the role of high priest has been taken from Eli, and yet someone of his line is still wearing the ephod, is still acting like high priest. So this role has not been dealt with formally, and it actually won't be dealt with completely until the temple and Solomon. So it seems to suggest that we have a king who's had his power taken away from him, being served by a priest who's had his power taken away from him. And it seems like it seems too coincidental not to be significant that we haven't really dealt with Eli or his family since this. So we have the Samuel narrative that picks up after the death of Eli, and now that Samuel is formally out of the picture, right, in chapter 12, now all of a sudden Eli's grandson shows up in the narrative. So it seems not coincidental, right? Samuel is gone, and now we're seeing Eli resurface. So it's probably not the most pleasant foreshadowing. Verse 4, there were sharp columns of rock on both sides of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine garrison. One was named Bozez and the other Seneh. One stood to the north in front of Michmash and the other to the south in front of Geba. Verse 6, Jonathan said to his attendant who carried his weapons, "Come on, let's cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by few or by many." Verse 7, his armor-bearer responded, "Do what is in your heart. You choose. I'm right here with you, whatever you decide." Yeah, I heard that groan, or that whatever. Verse 8, "All right," Jonathan replied, "we'll cross over to the men and then let them see us." So this story, right, particularly Jonathan climbing the mountain and taking on the Philistines single-handedly almost, is always told in a very positive way. And as I've said, I tend to be sympathetic to Saul more than you're probably used to, and I tend to be rather negative about David, and I'm going to be a little negative about Jonathan here, because this is insanity. This is crazy. This is a crazy idea that he's going to do. He's going to climb a rock face, letting the enemy see him. He's not even going to do it covertly, right? It's not like the enemy camp is on top of the mountain and they're watching the road or the pass or whatever, and he's like, "I got an idea. We're going to climb the opposite side," because they'd never expect that, right? They'd never look to watch their back because that's the bluff. We'll climb up the bluff behind them and get the drop on them. See, that would be smart. But he's not going to do that. Oh, no, no, no. He wants them to see him do this. This comes across as rather reckless, honestly. And even when the armor bearer is like, "Do whatever is in your heart," this kind of line is, there are places in Scripture where the heart is presented as somewhat positive, but then there are many, many times when it's presented as very negative. So it's hard to know whether to take this as positive or negative, right? The heart is deceitful beyond all things. Who can trust it? So the idea that the armor bearer is like, "Yeah, whatever you think's good, yeah, we'll go with it," it's hard to know if to take this as positive or not. And so then in verse 9, if they say, wait until we reach you, then we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up, then we will go up, because the Lord has handed them over to us. That will be our sign. Okay, so let's just be very clear about what his plan is, right? They're up on some sort of little crag or whatever, and he wants to reveal himself to the enemy, so they know he's coming, and he's going to wait to see if they invite him up. And if they say, come on up, he'll take that as an invitation that they want him to go up there and kill them. Now, I'm not a strategic mastermind. I don't have any proper military training, but I am pretty sure that in Military Tactics 101, very, very high on the list of things you don't do is needlessly reveal yourself to the enemy. And I'm pretty sure that they would teach in most military training institutions not to assume that your enemy wants you to come to them and kill them. And yet, Jonathan is going to assume both of these things. And this brings us back to, in the very preceding chapter, we've already had a judgment on Saul and on his dynasty. And again, this is shocking to me because we always want to paint Jonathan as a very, very positive light. And even I kind of lean towards wanting to see him as very positive. And yet, there has been a judgment on Saul's family, not just on Saul. Saul, we know, we're going to get to more of why Saul is flawed as a leader. But I can't help but wonder if this is to show us that Jonathan's perhaps a little reckless. Is this really what he's supposed to be doing? Is this really the right thing to do? Now, ultimately, he will be blessed. He will be rewarded for his actions. But just because God doesn't condemn what he does doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. I know this is very backwards how it's normally taught. But it seems like we're seeing two different approaches to leadership, and I'm not sure we're supposed to ultimately praise one or the other. But we'll keep going. So in verse 11, they let themselves be seen by the Philistine garrison, and the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've been hiding. The men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, come on up, and we'll teach you a lesson, they said. This, as I'm reading this, the only thing I can think of, the scene is from The Princess Bride. So for those of you who've seen the movie, the dread pirate Roberts, who's really Wesley, I know I just ruined it for you, is climbing up the rock face, and there's the swordman, Inigo Montoya, and he's been tasked with making sure that Roberts doesn't get to the top, right? So all he has to do is just drop a rock on his head, and that's it, right? Gravity will take care of the rest. But he doesn't want to do that because he's an honorable man. So he's waiting for Roberts to climb all the way to the top because he wants to have an honorable fight. And there's even a moment where Roberts gets to a point where he can't really climb up anymore. And so Montoya is like, well, I can help you up. And Roberts is like, why should I trust you? And then Montoya goes, well, I'm only waiting around to kill you, right? The idea is he doesn't like waiting. He just wants him to get up there so he can fight him. But again, the idea of waiting for your enemy to invite you up so that you can fight is rather counterintuitive, right? This is not usually how battles carry out. And even within this is clearly a comedy, right? This is meant to be funny. But as I'm reading this, all I can think of is that scene of Roberts trying to climb up the rock and Montoya just watching him do it and just waiting for him to come up, because that's not at all how most people fight battles. So in verse 12, follow me, Jonathan told his armor-bearer, for the Lord has handed them over to Israel. And all I can think of is Jonathan, climbing up this rock face with the Philistines just standing around waiting for him to climb up there, and him thinking, I've got them right where I want them, which is probably not the case. This is probably not an ideal situation. So in verse 13, Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor-bearer behind him. You can see them. There are documentaries of morons who climb mountains. Now, it's bad enough to climb a mountain, but there's a documentary. Just think about that for a second. Who is dumber, the one climbing the mountain or the idiot behind him carrying a camera climbing the mountain? That's who I want to know about. I don't care about the one that they're filming. Who's carrying the camera? So Jonathan is climbing up this mountain. He's got his hands and feet. The armor bearer is climbing up behind him carrying weapons. It's like, and we're all about Jonathan. Jonathan's the hero here. And I'm just imagining his little patsy behind him, having this backpack on his back with all this stuff, just clopping behind him. But anyway, so Jonathan cut them down, and his armor bearer followed and finished them off. Verse 14, in that first assault, Jonathan and his armor bearer struck down about 20 men in the half-acre field. So they climbed to the top, they fought off the little garrison, he killed about 20 of them, and then the rest fled or whatever, just Jonathan and his armor bearer. Then in verse 15, terror. Terror is probably the right word. This is not one of our more common words for fear. We have yareh, pahad, and so on. This is different and a much harsher word, so something more like terror or panic spread through the Philistine camp and the open fields to all the troops. Even the garrison and the raiding parties were terrified. The earth shook and terror spread from God. 16 to 17. When Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, they saw the panicking troops scattering in every direction. So Saul said to the troops with him, call the roll and determine who has left us. They called the roll and saw that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. Verse 18. Saul told Ahijah, bring the ark of God, for it was with the Israelites at that time. So this is interesting, right? Because Saul is with what army he has left. The high priest, or the one acting as the high priest, is with him, as well as the ark. Now, if you remember, right, back in chapter 7, we found out that the men of Kiriath Jearim came for the ark of the Lord and took it to Abinadab's house on the hill. They consecrated his son Eleazar to take care of it. The ark is currently not in the hands of the high priest, right? It's being watched over by someone else because the high priest has had his authority more or less revoked by God. So presumably this other person has brought it to Saul's camp so that it can be with the army. And there are a few places we get this kind of picture. But Deuteronomy 20 is one of the better places. So in Deuteronomy 20, we have, when you go to war against your enemies and see horses, chariots, and an army larger than yours, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is with you. When you're about to engage in a battle, the priest is to come forward and address the army. He is to say to them, listen, Israel, today you are about to engage in battle with your enemies. Do not be cowardly, do not be afraid, alarmed, or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. So, while it's never clearly explained, it seems like when Israel's to go to battle, the first thing they have to do is they have to have a priest or the high priest inquire of God whether or not they're supposed to do that. And there are plenty of examples where a priest has to give the blessing to go fight before they can go fight. One of the best examples of this is during the War of the Benjaminites. And Yahweh either says yes or no. And then when they go to fight, the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to go with them, right, to be God's presence on the battlefield. We saw this earlier with the Israelites fighting the Philistines. And so Saul has his priest, he has the ark, he's good to go, but he is supposed to inquire of God whether or not this is the right thing to do. So in verse 19, while Saul spoke to the priest, the panic in the Philistine camp increased in intensity. So Saul said to the priest, stop what you're doing. Now, we could, in the Holman says, stop what you're doing. The ESV and other translations say, Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Now the question is, what is the priest doing with his hand? And it's nothing, hopefully it's nothing too naughty. He is probably using the Urim and the Thummim. So the Urim and the Thummim are two stones that are entrusted to the high priest. We read about them earlier in Exodus. So there are a couple of verses, but Exodus 28:30, place the Urim and the Thummim in the breastplate for decisions, so that they will also be over Aaron's heart whenever he comes before the Lord. Aaron will continually carry the means of decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. So the Urim and the Thummim are two stones, and on one side is engraved the word Urim and Thummim. And these are used in some sort of divination ceremony. The ceremony itself is never explained in Scripture. The way I've heard one explanation, and it makes sense to me, although I don't know for sure this is what happened, is that these stones are sort of flat, like oblong, coin-ish shapes, and the priest would throw them in the air. And if they both fall head up, then that would be a yes. If they both fell head down, that would be a no. And if one fell head up and one fell head down, that would be a no answer. Because we know that the priest could ask a question, and the question usually needed to be yes or no. And God could answer yes, he could answer no, or he could give a non-answer. So it seems like Yahweh has only three options. Now, that is one way to explain it. I'm sure that there are many others, and I have no idea which one's right. The point is, the priest carried these two stones, and he somehow used them in a ceremony to determine what Yahweh's will was, and it seems like there were only three possible answers that could come out of the ceremony. So in this situation, the priest is going through the ceremony, right, to make sure that Yahweh wants them to go fight, and Saul has stopped the ceremony. How some have interpreted this is that Saul is now having some sort of cowardly moment, that he doesn't want to go into battle, or he's showing his hesitation or whatnot. And there's a really interesting, so we've already looked at Deuteronomy 20, 1-4, but in 5-9, we actually have a list of those who are ineligible for fighting, which includes cowards. So if you don't want to fight, you don't have to fight. This is, as far as I can tell, completely unique in the ancient world. Most ancient law codes say, if you don't want to fight, you don't have to, but there will be consequences. You can't just say, I don't feel like fighting and go home. Deuteronomy lets you. If you say, I don't feel like fighting, they won't make you, which is really interesting that there is a provision for that. Now, I assume that there would be certain cultural repercussions for not fighting, but you could do that. You could just say, I don't want to fight, and okay, you can go home. But what this seems to indicate, in my opinion, is we're seeing already kind of the two sides of Saul. That on the one hand, he can be overly cautious. And this seems to be on the heels of, again, the judgment of Samuel, that the covenant has been withdrawn from him. The authority of the king of the monarchy has been taken from him. And so now all of a sudden, it's like the confidence has been sapped from him. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to commit any taboos, so he's sitting around under the tree waiting for the right moment while his son's going off climbing rocks and doing reckless things. But then, out of the blue, when the Philistines starting to panic, all of a sudden he just kind of shifts on a dime into this impetuous mode. And this is going to be Saul moving forward. He will just sort of oscillate between being extremely cautious to the point where he's almost incapable of acting and being so impetuous that he's almost self-destructive. Maybe he's already bipolar. Maybe he's schizophrenic. Maybe he's already showing some sort of mental decline. But it seems like we are already seeing this within Saul. Just kind of these very radical shifts very quickly between, again, being very cautious and being very impetuous. And yeah, so we'll come back to that. So in verse 20, Saul and all the troops with him assembled and marched to the battle, and there the Philistines were fighting against each other in great confusion. There were Hebrews from the area who had gone earlier into the camp to join the Philistines, but even they joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So there are other Israelites who have aligned with the Philistines because they see that as the winning side, but now that the Philistines are panicking, and now that Saul has sort of gotten control of his army again, they realize, oh, we probably shouldn't be fighting against our fellow Israelites, and so now they want to switch sides and come back to the side of their own kin. So, opportunistic. Verse 22, when all the Israelite men who had been hiding in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they also joined Saul and Jonathan in the battle. So remember earlier, Saul was bleeding men because he had lost the authority by Samuel. He's lost his confidence. People are starting to lose faith in him as a king. But now that the Philistines are panicking, now that the fighting has started, and now that it looks like the Israelites are winning, people are flocking to come back. They want to join his army. They want to be part of this victory. Verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day. Not Jonathan. He doesn't get the credit for this. Certainly Saul doesn't get the credit. It was the Lord, right? This was the Lord's victory. Saul was indecisive, and then after Saul was indecisive, Jonathan was reckless, and then once it looked like the Philistines were fleeing, instead of asking the priest to make sure what God wanted them to do, he just sounded the call, and then they just rushed into battle. So neither Saul or Jonathan get credit for this. It's Yahweh who gets the credit, which to me is rather interesting. The rest of 23 going into 24, the battle extended beyond Beth-aven, and the men of Israel were worn out that day, for Saul had placed the troops under an oath. The man who eats food before evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies, is cursed. So none of the troops tasted any food. Again, we're not really sure where Beth-aven is. The assumption is that it is north of Michmash, possibly to the east of Bethel, so where the red dot is. In verse 25, everyone went into the forest, and there was honey on the ground. When the troops entered the forest, they saw the flow of honey, but none of them ate any of it because they feared the oath. So we'll get to the implications of this, but there are a couple places we could go, but in Deuteronomy, particularly chapter 23, we know that if you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to keep it, because he will require it of you, and it will be counted against you as sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, it will not be counted against you as sin. Be careful to do whatever comes from your lips, because you have freely vowed what you promised to the Lord your God. So Saul has made a vow, and there are implications of that, right? He needs to keep it. And he's attached a curse to it if you do not keep it. Now, we can get into, and we'll come back around to whether or not he should have made the vow. The point is he made the vow, and his men need to keep that vow because he as king made the vow. So then in verse 27, however, Jonathan had not heard his father make the troops swear the oath. He reached out with the end of the staff he was carrying and dipped it into the honeycomb. When he ate the honey, he had renewed energy. Verse 28, then one of the troops said, your father made the troops solemnly swear, the man who eats food today is cursed, and the troops are exhausted. Verse 29, Jonathan replied, my father has brought trouble to the land. Just look at how I have renewed energy because I have tasted a little honey. That he uses the word trouble is interesting. It occurs in a few places. Probably most notable is in Joshua 7 with the Achan incident. So when Achan sins, Joshua accuses him of causing trouble for the camp. I don't know if there's a direct parallel, but it is interesting. So in verse 30, how much better if the troops had eaten freely from the plunder they took from the enemies, then the slaughter of the Philistines would have been much greater. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Jonathan, but the point is Saul has made an oath. And now Jonathan is aware of the oath, which is, we'll come back to that. So then in verse 31, the Israelites struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash all the way to Ajalon. Michmash is where the blue is, to the northeast of Ramah, and Ajalon is all the way in the green to the west. So it's like, it seems as though they've cleared out, this is the area between Benjamin and Dan, which should cover, so they basically, it seems like from this verse, they've run the Philistines out of Benjamin territory. They've reclaimed all this area. Since the Israelites were completely exhausted, they rushed to the plunder, took sheep, cattle, and calves, slaughtered them on the ground, and ate meat with the blood still in it. And this is a big no-no. So going all the way back to Genesis 9, every living creature will be food for you. As I gave the green plants, I have given you everything. However, you must not eat meat with its lifeblood in it. I will require the life of every animal and every man for your life and your blood. I will require the life of each man's brother for a man's life. This is part of the covenant God made with Noah, and seems to have implications for all mankind, not just the Israelites, the Jews, the Hebrews, and so forth. There are plenty of stories, and I'm thinking in the story of Siegfried and Gunther, part of the Nibelung saga, there's a scene where I believe it is, I want to say it's Gunther, but one of the heroes has been accused of rebelling against the others, and so they've holed themselves up in the main hall, and their little band is fighting off against the ones who are coming to capture them. And so they're fighting and fighting and fighting, and they're killing and they're killing. And to the point where the floor is just soaked in blood. And they're all exhausted. And they don't know what to do because they're so tired and weary. So the leader, I can't remember if it's Gunther or Siegfried, one of them says, why don't we just drink the blood from the ground because there's so much of it. So they're drinking blood. And the idea is that they're becoming animals, right? They're becoming monsters. So this idea that drinking blood is wrong it's not exclusive to just the Bible, right? Drinking blood is usually something that only animals do. But there are other places where we see the prohibition against drinking blood. So Leviticus 17, anyone from the house of Israel or from the foreigners who live among them who eats any blood, I will turn against that person who eats blood and cut him off from his people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you and no foreigner who lives among you may eat blood. So, don't eat the blood, right? That's bad. Very, very bad. So in verse 33, some reported to Saul, look, the troops are sinning against the Lord by eating meat with the blood still in it. And I can just picture Saul just absolutely exasperated. I mean, again, I tend to be a little sympathetic to Saul, this poor guy. He didn't want to be king. He was kind of forced into it. He had a pretty decent start, but it seems like everything he does ends up turning badly. Even when he tries to do the right thing, it usually blows up in his face. And so he made this vow, which was probably a dumb thing to do. And now here he is, having overseen this great victory. The Philistines are finally driven from the land, and his people are lapping blood like animals. And he just has to watch this, right? And he knows this is wrong, right? He knows he's screwed up, and he doesn't know how to fix it, right? Because this is such a bad problem. So Saul said, you have been unfaithful. Roll a large stone over here at once. Verse 34. He then said, go among the troops and say to them, each man must bring me his ox or his sheep. Do the slaughtering here, and then you can eat. Don't sin against the Lord by eating meat with the blood in it. So every one of the troops brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had built an altar to the Lord. It's an interesting inclusion that he had never done it before. Maybe there had not been a need. Maybe this is an indictment against him that he hadn't been doing it. I don't know. But the idea is he needs to make an altar so that they can properly offer these animals as sacrifices and then eat them appropriately, right? So they're not just eating them raw and drinking the blood, which clearly they're not supposed to be doing. Verse 36. Saul said, let's go down after the Philistines tonight and plunder them until morning. Don't let even one remain. Do whatever you want, the troops replied. But the priest, this is probably again Ahijah, said, we must consult God here. So Ahijah is still with the army. Presumably it's the same guy. And by saying consult, he probably means that they're going to have to use the Urim and the Thummim, right? So in verse 37, so Saul inquired of God, should I go after the Philistines? Will you hand them over to Israel? But God did not answer him that day. So now the text, we're going to have to fill in a few blanks here. As I've already said, the priest, right, before the king or whoever can order attacking, they have to ask God, should we go? And then the priest asks God, and then the priest usually gets one of three answers, yes, no, or just no answer. And it seems as though God's not giving an answer. Why? Why is there no answer? The assumption seems to be, certainly by Saul, that Yahweh is angry for some reason. That's why he's not blessing them to go forward and keep killing the Philistines. Now, the question is, what is Yahweh angry about? And oh boy, where do we start? Could it be over the drinking of the blood? Could it be, it's interesting, right? Because earlier, when Saul agreed to issue the command to go fight, it was in the middle of the ceremony. They didn't finish to make sure Yahweh wanted them to fight then either. So now all of a sudden, right, Saul wants to keep fighting, and the priest's like, whoa, we still haven't finished asking God whether we should or not. And so now that they've done the ceremony, they find out that they're not really sure what God wants them to do. So the presumption seems to be by Saul that there's sin in the camp. Oh boy, someone has sinned. This, again, seems to hearken back to the Achan incident with Joshua. And that's why God's mad, and that's why God's not giving his blessing to go finish off the Philistines. So who has sinned? So verse 38. Saul said, "All you leaders of the troops, come here, let us investigate how this sin has occurred today." Again, this is very reminiscent of what Joshua did with Achan, right? So it's not as though Saul is necessarily acting inappropriately here. I mean, there's plenty we have to contradict, to be angry with Saul over. But it's like all of a sudden the priest has reminded him there are certain things that they need to do, right? There are certain obligations, and now Saul is trying to adhere to that. So in verse 39, "As surely as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, even if it is because of my son Jonathan, he must die." Not one of the troops answered him. So again, now we have another vow by Saul, that he's going to find whose sin has angered Yahweh, and he is going to punish that person. Okay. But, again, this seems reminiscent of the Achan story, and that's what Joshua had to do, right? He had to kill Achan. So maybe Saul is aware of the Achan story. Maybe he knows this is what he has to do. I don't know. So in verse 40, "So he said to all Israel, 'You will be on one side, and I and my son Jonathan will be on the other side.' And the troops replied, 'Do whatever you want.'" It's like the troops don't even care at this point. Verse 41. "So Saul said to the Lord, 'God of Israel, give us the right decision.' Jonathan and Saul were selected, and the troops were cleared of the charge." So presumably he was going to eliminate him and Jonathan and then go through the camp, kind of like Joshua did, until he found what group had committed the sin and then work on narrowing it out. But right off the bat, it's him and Jonathan. Well, obviously it's something, right? Obviously it's something that Saul did. Verse 42. "Then Saul said, 'Cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan.' And Jonathan was selected." Oh boy. It's not Saul's sin that was selected. I'm sure Saul has plenty of sins that Yahweh could be mad about, but it was Jonathan. Jonathan has committed some sort of act against the community. This is very reminiscent of the Jonah story, right? He's on the boat, and the storm is supernaturally bad, and the sailors are like, we have to figure out who has sinned because this isn't a normal storm, and the lot falls on Jonah, and then Jonah confesses, "Oh yeah, I've ticked off my crazy desert mountain god, and he's followed me out onto the ocean." And then they throw him into the water, right? And that appeases Yahweh. So they go through a similar process to narrow it to Jonathan, which seems to confirm that Jonathan has sinned. He's done something wrong, and he has to atone for that. Verse 43, "Saul commanded him, 'Tell me what you did.' Jonathan told him, 'I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff I was carrying. I am ready to die.'" Verse 44, "Saul declared to him, 'My God, may God punish me and do so severely if you do not die, Jonathan.'" Now, this is immediately recognizable, or I think the initial comparison we would make is with Jephthah, right? Jephthah made a silly vow, which resulted in him needing to sacrifice his daughter. But there's a similar story, similar-ish story, in Greek mythology, which is the story of Agamemnon and his daughter Iphigenia. So in the story of Agamemnon, Agamemnon is the king who invades Troy, right? And he goes to the priest, and he tells the priest, "I want to invade Troy, and I need all the gods I can get on my side." And the priest says, "Well, Poseidon says he will fight for you. But to get his blessing, you must offer what is most precious to you." And of course, what is most precious to Agamemnon is his youngest daughter, Iphigenia. So, and there's an entire play. The play is Iphigenia, which is a brilliant play, and it's written from the daughter's perspective. And the play is about the moral dilemma that Agamemnon is in. Because we might immediately associate and go, well, obviously you don't kill your daughter, right? That's just the wrong thing to do. But that ignores the dilemma that Agamemnon is in, because this is a multifaceted problem. And we're going to see that this is an issue for Saul, because I think perhaps Saul's connection to Agamemnon might be even stronger than Jephthah's. So with the Agamemnon story, right, there's two dimensions to this dilemma. The first dimension is obviously social. Agamemnon is a father, and as a father, he has an obligation to take care of his family. He has an obligation, a moral obligation to take care of his daughter, which would mean his obligation to his daughter outweighs everything else. You don't kill your kids, right? However, Agamemnon is also king. As such, he has an obligation to his people. And as king, right, as king, objectively, what is one life versus the well-being of an entire nation? Again, he has to think of this objectively, right, because he is king. This is not an emotional choice, right? One life versus the prosperity of his people. So there's Agamemnon the father in tension with Agamemnon the king. But that's just the social level. There's also the supernatural level, which is, on the one hand, he has Poseidon, who has demanded the sacrifice. And if he doesn't offer the daughter, Poseidon's going to be mad, right? Because Poseidon, in his benevolence, has said, if you give me the daughter, I will give you my blessing, which you need to win the battle. And if you don't offer your daughter, then I'm not going to be very happy with you. And you don't want Poseidon mad at you, right? Because he's the god of the entire ocean. But there's also another god in the story, or rather a goddess. There's the goddess Artemis, the virgin huntress. And she's the goddess or protector of virgins. And she says, you don't kill virgins. Child sacrifice is a big no-no to Artemis. So if he does offer the sacrifice, he's going to get Artemis against him. So no matter what he does, he is screwed. He's going to fail socially, one level. He'll either fail as a king or he'll fail as a father. And even supernaturally, he is going to anger one of the gods. Right? And this is the whole point of the play, is if Iphigenia, watching her father go through these kind of various levels of dilemma, and then in the end, she willingly sacrifices herself because she can't make her father choose. It's a great play. It's sad, but I mean, that's the kind of the point. And we have Saul. Poor Saul. Again, I just kind of feel sorry for this guy. He's not a great king, but just everything he does just kind of blows up in his face. And he now has made this vow, which maybe he shouldn't have made. Okay, fine. But he's made it. And his son has violated the vow. And he has now been told that Yahweh is not happy with the fact that Jonathan has violated the vow. And he's already said that even if it was his own son, he would have to kill him, right? So he has another vow on top of the first vow because he can't help himself, because he's kind of an idiot. And so we have the overly cautious Saul who doesn't know how to act because he's afraid of offending Yahweh. But then we also have his impetuous side that kind of acts without thinking. And so we see this guy who's just completely beside himself. He doesn't know what to do. And Jonathan seems to have accepted his fate. Like, if this needs to happen, it happens. Because, again, Jonathan kind of acts without thinking. He tends to be a little reckless. And we love it about him, right? We love that he can be a bit of a reckless hero. But Yahweh has revealed that Jonathan has sinned against the community and something needs to happen. So Saul, being torn between these decisions, and again, almost in parallel with Agamemnon, because Jephthah, because again, I think the Jephthah story in many ways is a perversion of the Abraham story, because Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son, but ultimately doesn't have to go through with it. Jephthah does go through with it, I think, and actually kills his daughter. But Saul, almost more like Agamemnon, can't choose. Right? He just can't bring himself to make a choice. So the army has to step in because they want to say. So in verse 45, but the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, who accomplished such a great deliverance for Israel? No, as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he worked with God's help today. So the people redeemed Jonathan, and he did not die. Now, ultimately, there's no weighing in on whether or not this is the right decision. Did Jonathan deserve to die, or didn't he? And I kind of wonder if the point isn't so much about whether or not Jonathan should have died or not, but rather the fact that Saul just can't choose. Right? He can't do what needs to be done. He can't pardon Jonathan and say, as king, I will pardon him and I will accept the consequences, or say, I made a vow, it was a dumb vow, but I made it. Yahweh is angry, I have to kill my own son. Right? As king, he needs to come down on one or the other, right? He has to make a decision, and he can't do it. This seems to just be one more example of his failure as a king, because as king, you have to make choices, hard choices, and then just see them through. But he can't do that, right? Because he's so torn between these two extremes. So in verse 46, then Saul gave up the pursuit of the Philistines, and the Philistines returned to their own territory. So because he wasn't able to carry through the judgment of Jonathan, Yahweh never blessed it, right? He never blessed the fight. He never blessed Saul's victory, and Saul just accepted that and let the Philistines go. And that's it for chapter 14.
Saul is a mess. All right. Well, Mr. Larry, would you close us in prayer tonight?